Um, well, welcome to the session. You see, it's actually quite interesting, right? So the hip question actually was more popular, right? So you see, there were way more people at the hip session than the scoliosis one, which is a bit sort of surprising, but anyway. So fact is that we have to cover quite a lot of ground, and as I was kind of preparing for the for this webinar, I was going through several stages. So my first original plan was to kind of dive in straight away and discuss the ABR perspective on the on the entire thing. But then I realized that probably it makes sense for me to start with like much more of the like background, right? So because you see, if we put it like this, so like I will try to limit myself today to 1 hour so that you have the time for the questions and answers, and probably we are not going to fit everything, if especially if it comes to the specifics of the ABR perspective and all the nuances. But well, we'll just do another one, right? So but I just want to do it right so that we have all the backgrounds there, because what I believe, or I realize I need to cover, right? So you see, we need to cover the original sort of idea and understanding of what scoliosis is, right? So you see how it's interpreted in the classic sense, because all of you, you have some, like basic presupposition what scoliosis is. And of course, then the main thing is your interaction with the medical community. So where you get the x-rays, right? So you see, and the x-rays give you some information, and there's some mysterious lines and angles on those x-rays, which is very important to understand what they actually are able to tell and what they are unable to tell, so that you navigate in this space, right? And then we would also need to discuss the standard ways of approaching the problem, so which typically would come with different forms of braces. So, and the same story, we have to cover like the pluses and minuses. What are the background ideas there? What is being declared to you? What is the real kind of meaning of it? What could be the hidden ways how these tools are working, and so that's what I understood, that if we really want to achieve the understanding, so we can use this format of a webinar where we have this kind of opportunity to look at the pictures, and when you can be concentrated without being distracted on like behavior of the child and so on, that we face during the, for example, the live sessions. But even when we discuss those things with the with the videos and of your case reviews, so still we don't have time to get really into the details. So that's really my plan. So we start with the background of what scoliosis is. We go into the measurements, and then we move into the typical treatments with braces and surgery, right? And then, of course, we'll also cover what would be the differences between the standard interpretations of scoliosis for, let's say, ordinary people, right? And what are the additional nuances of the scoliosis, like so-called neuromuscular scoliosis in cerebral palsy, or say genetic conditions. So, and you know me, I have a tendency to go into the detail, and I would always add some sort of links and detours and so on. So, and that will form a background necessary to bring us towards the good understanding of where we are and what could be offered to you via the standard sort of means of you know of management of the scoliosis, right? And then we can build the good ground for the ABR transition. So that's the plan. Let me move towards the pictures, and then we will be able to start. Okay, so what are we going to start with? we are going to start with first the external view, right? Because when we discuss the scoliosis, right, so that there is the external view of what you see kind of with your naked eye at your child's sort of body. And then, of course, there is what the X-ray is telling you about the uh, specifics of alignment and the relative sort of positioning of the elements within the spine and the rib cage. So now let's start with the basics. Of course, here are the three main components which are observable in scoliosis. So that would be the uneven shoulders, that would be the curve in the spine, and that would be what is called the uneven hips. So these are the three main components. But of course, the primary measurement, right? The primary measurement and the primary focus in the entire concept of scoliosis goes into the curve of the spine. So as you all aware, right? So when you get some information from your doctor about what kind of scoliosis is there, you get a certain number, you get the measurement, which is the angle within the spine. So that's kind of the first thing for us to understand, that if we look at the entire thing, we have to see these three components. Now, as we move further, so what we want to understand as the background information, and it also going to give us some idea of like why there is so much preoccupation with the whole hip thing and the message about the hip and the scoliosis. So let me draw a straight set of straight lines here. So what is the main set of ideas behind it? So the main set of ideas is this. So if you draw the horizontal line, another horizontal line, and then a lot of horizontal lines which would be going via the individual spines, that's kind of the reference grid at which people are looking. And that brings us into this central point, drawing their vertical line, right? So you see, that's really the thing. So what you have to understand is that total thinking in the interpretation of scoliosis is very, very basic, very, very old. It and comes from the idea that you can actually look at scoliosis as a stack of bones put on top of each other. So what does it mean? So once you understand this, then you got some basic ideas. So the first idea which comes into this is the idea that there is a straight line which corresponds to the g-force, right? So the vertical line. So that g-force and the vertical line, that's kind of the optimal positioning, right? And then there is this idea that if this is a stack, then what happens? Then there is a weight that presses from the top towards the bottom. So what does it mean? So that means that if we take the top, you see here, when you look at the level of the shoulders, that's a weight of the head that pushes onto the shoulders, right? So the head is like one, depending on your age, would be anywhere from 1/8 to one, say, quarter or 1/5 of your size, right? So you see, the idea is that the weight of the head is relatively small, right? So now, if you look at the thoracic part, so now it's already that much, right? So you see, now it's the one kind of third of the body pushing at the bottom third of the body. And then if you look further, for example, by the time it comes to the hip level, so it's the total half of the body, which is being the weight exerting towards the lower part. So if you follow this logic, so that means that what is the most likely problem? Well, the heavier is the weight, right? So the more the thing is going to experience, the more load is going to experience, so the more likely it's get distorted. So that's why the typical expectation, right, is to have the primary problem in the lumbar spine. So then the secondary expectation would be to have the problem in the thoracic spine. So that's the basic logic, the basic standard logic, which is applied to the analysis of the scoliosis. And then everything comes from it. So why, for example, people put braces? The brace is supposed to force the spine from the curved position into the straight one, right? And why the main load comes, the main support comes at the bottom? Because this is the area which is assumed to be the most problematic. So that's really how the reasoning goes. At this point, at this point, I'm not going to bring any arguments against it. Although you understand that obviously, I find this not just overly simplistic, but plain wrong, right? So you see, the whole thing works in a much like more sophisticated and complicated way, right? So it works as a total unit. So you can't really make this arbitrary idea of the, spines pushing on each other. But, let's kind of put this aside temporarily. So we are now in the educational part where you want to understand really what's the logic behind every sort of step of reasoning and what you are being offered in the from the medical community. So once we understood this, then our next step is to further move further. So what is our next step? So we also have to understand that besides of this curvature that goes to the side, there is also their additional deformity. Additional deformity which manifests as their two typical factors. So one side bulges, in this scenario that's the right side, and the other side of the rib cage is depressed. Now we have to make an important notion that although this component is included into the understanding that this kind of the conversation about the rib cage deformity, and in that sense also when you are being explained what are the risks of the scoliosis, you're being told, well, the scoliosis potentially is going to deform the organs, right? So, and that's why it's risky. But the paradox is there are really no good measurements. So because the total thing, when you look at the total combination, you've got 12 ribs on each side, and they have this complex, like a bucket handle shape, and they have multiple attachments at the spine and then on the front at the sternum and then onto each other. So to measure this curve is practically impossible. So that's why there have been kind of multiple attempts to do so, but they never really brought anything significant. And that's why until today, mainly the conversation and the total set of measurements goes into the spine itself. So I just want you to keep a note of this because that's where we are going to get back to this important thing. So, and I've just pulled some pictures from the internet. You see, this is that reasoning. So this is some kind of a doctor who is looking at the x-ray and explaining the patient what's going on, right? So using the picture of the spine. And see, when you look at this picture of the spine, you realize that this is that kind of reasoning that is behind it. So that taking the spine out, putting it as a column that is supported from the bottom, less weight at the top, more at the bottom. And you see this gentleman is, for example, showing here these things, right? So you see he has this focus on the distortions and like this kind of stuff. So that's what we get from the reason behind it, right? So you see, like, it's a transition. So when in the natural presentation, when you look at the person, you see this, right? You see the curvature, you see this, the unevenness and the curve of the spine, but the reasoning moves kind of with the X-ray vision, what's happening inside, and the main image there is the image of the spine. So I would even close this and move further. So this is where I'm just got the typical X-rays. Well, actually, I pulled it from the Russian website, so that's why it says the second degree, third degree, and the fourth degree. So scoliosis, in that sense, is measured in the in 4 degrees. So the the milder one, that, well, the first one is supposed to be preclinical, right? So it's like below 20 degrees. So then you've got the second one, 20 degrees, and then between until 40 degrees would be the third one, and then would be above 40 degrees, that will be the fourth one. So now the thing is, you might say, oh, as I look at this picture, what I see that the spine and the rib cage is really getting worse. But what are those mysterious numbers, those degrees? So let's get and move on, trying to understand what this whole thing actually means. I've also pulled this from the internet, so that's where they say patient's Cobb angle measurement allows us to classify the condition according to the severity scale, mild, moderate, or severe. But now let's understand how this measurement is being achieved. So when you look at the X-rays, when you are being given of your child, so typically you would see something like this. You would see these lines being drawn. And of course, when you look at this line, it's like you're trying to measure it, and it might not be easy to understand, because you see here there are two things. So look, these lines, the blue ones, they are crossing. And then here, if the scoliosis is milder, right? So you see these lines are not crossing. So in fact, you would, in this scenario, imagine this situation when you would take this line and kind of continue it, and then you would continue it until they cross somewhere in space. So that's the logic, right? But in order to, because then you have to draw it outside of the X-ray. So then what do? You do the geometric transition. So you draw, the opposite line. So then cross, and then you get these angles which are equivalent to each other. This angle and this angle. Now, I know a lot of you are mathematically challenged and maybe even traumatized, right? So you see, let's kind of get this clear so there would be no misunderstandings. You get the information about the scoliosis of your child measured in these degrees, right? So you see, and these degrees are done according to the Cobb angle. So Cobb is a person, so it's a orthopedic surgeon. I think it's like 1940s or something like this. So when he came with that measurement, and that measurement very quickly became the standard. So what is a tricky thing about this measurement, right? Because obviously when it comes to the observation of the live person, you have hard time measuring, right? And then there were all sorts of attempts to draw kind of straight lines and then try to measure it, how far the spine would go. But this is really difficult to understand and get anything consistent via this type of measurement. So Mr. Cobb, he came up with a trick. So his trick was, instead of trying to measure the vertical, which is the kind of final idea, you want to understand the scoliosis as a vertical deviation, use the geometric trick and transform it into the horizontal measurement, because it's practically, in practical terms, it's much more convenient and much more reliable. So what did he do? Right? So he came with this idea. Here you've got the main terminology of Mr. Cobb. So what did he want to achieve? Right? So you see, he wanted a reliable measurement where you can get the idea of what's happening, which would be kind of correlating to the total condition. So what was his idea? So his idea was to find the top vertebra, which is tilted, and the bottom vertebra, which is tilted, and then measure the horizontal tilt. And then as you measure the tilt of the top one and then measure the tilt of the bottom one, right? So you draw the lines, and these lines eventually would cross. So that would give you the angle. So effectively, you see, if you take the vertebra and then sort of put the pivot inside it, and then you see if it sits horizontally, then what kind of Cobb angle you're going to have? Your Cobb angle is going to be 0, right? Suppose we take a picture, suppose that was a straight spine. So then, or let's suppose we take the T1 and T9, right? So you see, in this example, the T1 is not tilted. So if I draw the line through it, and if I draw the line through the T9, you see, these lines, they stay parallel. So if the lines stay parallel, they never cross. So that means they're truly horizontal. And that means that if we take a 90-degree angle, that would be vertical, right? So, but now, if we look at the, for example, T3 here, the thoracic vertebra number 3, and then the thoracic vertebra number 7, right? So you see, those are tilted. So that's why if we extend those lines, we are going to get this picture. So that's really the main idea. And once we understood this, now let's move to my more detailed slide here. So you see, this is where you've got the main terms. So the main terms are, this would be the most tilted one from the top. This is called the end vertebra. Then at the bottom, that would be another end vertebra. And then you have to find those and make those lines between them, because they describe the angle between them, would be the apex of the curve. And you see, because this is a kind of bilateral, or the bilateral deviation, so this part would be called the main curvature, and the lumbar part here would be called the minor curvature. So for this one, again, there could be this corresponding measurement, which would be also having its own curve. Now, so what do you understand? So when it's drawn in this way, then everything kind of, and the schematic representation, everything looks nice and simple, right? But what does it mean? So if we start counting the vertebra, see, here would be our T1. That's T1, right? So you see, that's the idea that T1 is straight. And then, now this is T2, T3, T4, and so on. And now you have to find, you meaning the radiologist, the person who reads the x-rays, right? Now you have to find the vertebra which is the most tilted. So what does it mean? So it's not so easy. You understand this point, right? So it's not so easy to find the vertebra. Okay, this is T3. So we found it, but now what's happening? Because of this particular way of measuring things, see, let me just do 2 examples. So now I've drawn it like that. I've drawn it like that. So you see, when I look at this x-ray, So I got this angle, and as you can see here, then I do the orthogonal lines to them, and then I do another orthogonal line, and then over here I would get my measure. But what's happening? There is a big problem here, because you are measuring an individual inclination, and as you can see here, these two vertebrae, the T3 and T7, they are the most tilted. If you look at their spacing with the next one, this spacing is the greatest. So which means that if the vertebrae are very close to each other, then the tilt is relatively less. And if there is just some spacing between them, so then the tilt suddenly increases. So let's try to translate it into the normal language. What does it mean? That means that this measurement itself, for example, the 58 degrees. So this is obviously a bad scenario, right? So it's a 58 degrees. But for example, we are starting to work, and our task is to say, can we improve the total? Well, if we want to improve the total situation, by right, we need to see some mobility, right? So you see some room for movement, because when the individual vertebrae are all kind of stuck together, obviously there is no room for improvement there. So, and when the vertebrae are stuck together, then also the mobility of the child becomes very problematic. So if we look at the total thing, the muscles and so on, how the spine would be working, so the fused spine is not working so well. But this method, as you can see, is very strongly optimized to favor their orthopedic thinking. So meaning that if we were to add additional 2 millimeters between the other vertebrae, and then additional 2 millimeters here between the T3 and T2, or for example, improve the connection between the T3 and T2, but then seeing the increase of the spacing between the T2 and T1, what's going to happen? Slight change of distance. See, let me just try to draw it, right? So if I do one in red here, and I increase the space by maybe like 2 millimeters. Then if the space increases by 2 millimeters, then I would need to start my angle here, and then suddenly 2 millimeters at the actual vertebra, by the time I stretch it into the crossing, these 2 millimeters here, or if I add another 2 millimeters there, so then 2 millimeters that I have, they are going to translate into quite dramatic increase of the curve. So that's really a very big point. Or suppose that if things change at the top here, and then suddenly we have some increasing unlocking of the T8, and the T8 connects better to T7, then what can happen? So then suddenly this angle would change. So, and because Cobb angle doesn't specify where we measure the worst vertebra. So maybe instead of T7, it would become T9 or T8. So then that's how we can suddenly have a jump. So from 58, it would become 70, or I don't know, especially if the spine, we'll look afterwards at the spines of the children with CP. So these jumps could happen very quickly because they are very fused. So you see, that's really the main point, is that the total representation of the Cobb angle is based on the tilt of the individual vertebrae. So the best Cobb angle is achieved when the whole thing is tightly squeezed together. The more tightly they're squeezed together, the less room for the movement of the individual vertebra over the disc, the more stable the angle is going to be. So that's really the key point for you to understand, is that this measurement itself cements and favors their fusion. So there would be the maximum reduction of the mobility and, like any room for movement and flexibility within the spine. So that's really the key. So the idea behind is that, because this we come to the main point, in the standard setting, the whole idea is that you cannot reverse or improve anything about the structural scoliosis unless you do the surgery and kind of force them, right? So that's why, like basically your job is to fight against the deterioration. And fight against the deterioration means fusing them together. So that's really the main logic. Nobody is trying to improve the mobility. Nobody is having the ambition on the idea how we can get the whole thing more open, more alive, more flexible, and so on. The main point is how to fuse it together. So that's the underlying logic behind it, and the measurement of the Cobb angle really cements this entire approach. So once we get this, now let's move on into their further understanding. So, and you see, this is a kind of complicated measurements where you can easily get stressed observing those angles, right? Because you see one line, another line, these lines have all this kind of roundings, but there's no point in getting stressed. All you need to know is that this whole thing is based on the idea on the most inclined vertebra. So that's the main thinking behind the Cobb angle. And you see here could be all sorts of combinations. Here this is the example of how this reasoning is arrived, right? And you see here on this particular one, so you see they've sort of drawn the lines through each of the vertebrae, and these ones with the dots, they've been identified as the main ones because they are the most inclined. So here you've got the angle. But my point is this, that is once again sits on the fusion. So the more fusion within the system, the more stable is the angle itself. So, and here I'm adding this picture, which is quite typical because that puts their additional perspective, right? So you see in this one, I put the additional perspective of the pelvis. And since we put the additional perspective of the pelvis, I will get back to this demo, right? So you see uneven hips, and that is the one that explains a lot why there is so much conversation between why there is so much conversation about the hip subluxation and the scoliosis. Because the logic here is, so this is the pelvis. The pelvis has to be straight to support the vertical line. If the support of the pelvis at the bottom is somehow tilted, right? So you see, if the bottom part tilts, so instead of being horizontal, this line, for example, tilts like that, right? So you see, if the line tilts, well, that's not the line, okay. If the line tilts, what happens? So now the logic is that if the line tilts, then the vertical line starts falling. So effectively that would mean the entire spine would be falling even more. So that's why what you're being told, your child is sitting on the sitting platform. If the hip is subluxed, that means that one level is higher, and that as a result creates the tilt of the pelvis, or in this picture creates this tilt of the pelvis, which makes the spine like a falling tower. The spine is falling even further. So that's why the surgeon who is doing the hip fusion and telling you, look, the x-ray is now looking good. So then this surgeon is very happy with himself because he says, you know what, now I put the balanced straight support, so the tilt is not going to increase. Now, of course, we understand that this is like, this is such a dramatically primitive reasoning which completely denies the fact that in reality it's not working like this. In reality, in your child's situation, the main trouble is not the line itself, but the main trouble comes back to this, that it's the total situation where it's the fused connection, direct bypass that goes as the iliopsoas triangle that connects all the way to the lumbar. So the twist comes from the bottom. So whatever you do here at this level by trying to put them more even doesn't make any sense, because if you, by fusion of the vertebra, you are creating the additional twist, like you're destabilizing, you're taking away the opportunity to adjust at the free legs. You're fusing them together. Now the legs are twisting the spine even more. So that's really the key thing, is to understand that the whole thing has, in reality, has tensional connections. And it's the tensional connections which define what's going to happen. But the orthopedic reasoning is take a skeleton, take an x-ray, put it in a simple stack of blocks, and then, like they feel themselves very proud and happy if they manage to put their, like the level the whole thing, right? So for them, if the hip is subluxed, it's as if you were, like standing with one flat shoe and the other shoe being the high heeled, and that would kind of cause the whole tilt. So that's really the main sort of difference, the main discussion, the main challenge that comes in the conversations with the surgical profession and with the physical therapy profession. So, and you have to realize that when you communicate with them, you will not be able to change their mindset. They have their, this is like imprinted in their worldview, and you saw it through those pictures when, like these are the people who are looking at that through the x-ray. Is the pelvis, the x-ray, and then the spine, and they try to force the spine, and then, like then everything would kind of get correct. So now we're getting back to my picture. So now you understand 19 degrees, that's small, right? So you see we can do it ourselves now. So you see roughly what we're going to find. We're going to find this one, which is the least tilted, right? So you see then it's going to move somewhere here. And you see here at the bottom, there is not much change. So you see the bottom ones are relatively flat. So, okay, let's say it's this one, yeah? So now you see I get these degrees. So you see like they end up behind the picture. So in order to count, or in order to calculate how it works, I have to draw the straight line here, right? And I have to draw the perpendicular here, and then I have to draw the perpendicular there, right? And that's going to be my 19 degrees. Now let's look at this one. So what's happening here? Boom, you've got the fusion of the vertebrae. So here at the top, you see two vertebrae, they got fused together. So then ping, ping, the whole thing got tilted. So you've got now the worst vertebra, the most tilted one is there. And also you see the thing tilting at the bottom. So now at the bottom, this is not. So you see now, you see it's a different vertebra. See, this is the most tilted one. So suddenly we moved, we now changed the level of the tilt. So it's a different vertebra that we're now using. And because it got this one spot where it got more fused, so you already have a dramatic change in the total orientation. And you can see that this spot itself very much comes from the fusion of the ribs. So once the ribs fuse, then you got the spinal adjustment there. And then, of course, if you look further here, now this tilt, suddenly the worst tilt is here. See, that's a very single, very sharp vertebra here. And the worst one is going to be this. So now my angle is that. So effectively, this used, systematically, this have been the worst position. This has been the worst kind of placement there, right? But now you've got this change of the angles, which is really not very reflective of what's specifically happening there. So it's different vertebra, different situation, and so on. And now imagine that in this case, we somehow started to improve the mobility further down within the spine. So, but then adding a little bit of mobility in the spine or a little bit of mobility at the top would translate into even further sudden jump of this change of the angle. So that's really the image that you have to understand, that the measurements themselves, they're really not giving you a very accurate sort of reflection of the bigger picture. It's very, very, very simple and very, very selective about the, what where the theoretical picture sort of forces you to follow it. And you see here, that's also the one that I pulled from the Russian website. Oops. So this is the one 9 years old, 13, 18, 29, right? So you see that will be this dramatic situation. But then this time we are going to skip it, but for the next time, we are, of course, going to keep this in mind, because what you see here, once you start looking at the development and what kind of challenges are truly happening there, you would see, look, the vertebrae are whitening in the central part, right? So you see, and then the ribs are disconnecting. The ribs are collapsing on each other. Which ribs? The bottom ribs, right? And what's happening here, you see that everything within the spine becomes fused and white, right? So when it becomes white, that means it's completely dehydrated. There is no space, there is nothing. So like everything just like got snatched together. So, but the question is, when we look here, for example, at the before, at the earlier scenario, at the one from before, and the one here, 9 years old, 18 years old, and take the person at the 13 years old. So what we would say, in order to improve the situation, we want to bring it back. We want to keep the spaces between the vertebrae, because that's what gets lost later, right? But then now I understood. For example, we take this X-ray, and if we were trying to improve the spacing, that would punish us with the worsening angle. So that's really the greatest challenge here, is that if we catch the situation here in the less severe thing, so if we want to go back, we want to improve the spacing, we want to connect the ribs and so on. But that in turn, because of the design of the Cobb measurement, is going to punish the X-ray. So because adding a couple of millimeters of extra spacing there, you might get the additional tilt, and that tilt would suddenly go. So, oh, it used to be 19 degrees and now it's, or like it used to be, say, 25 degrees and suddenly it become 40 degrees, right? So what does it mean? If it's 40 degrees, everybody is going to freak out, panic, and then, oh, wow, like things are getting much worse. So you see here, like the angles are getting worse and so on. So that's the point. So when we are here in this kind of 30, 40 degrees range, it's a very sensitive situation. So by right, you want to get it via, you want to improve the spacing, right? Because here the ribs are collapsed. Sorry, here on the left, before you see the ribs were spaced and connected better. And in the middle here, they are poorly spaced and they are more, and they're detached from the vertebra and they're fused. So what do we want? We want to unpack the ribs from each other. We want to bring it back towards the better total distribution. But when we try to do this, what's going to happen? The angle might get worse. So that is really the main block, the main challenge in this total development of and evolution. So that this potential that the angles and the measurements of which are being taken there decisively orthopedic there. And that's why, for example, I'm looking at this one, and this one is telling us that this is the situation that has improved, right? So you see, that's an example of the relatively successful treatment with the use of the braces. When we look at this, we understand, okay, things are looking kind of straighter, yes, but what you're seeing here, to a great extent, the spacing between the vertebrae didn't change. Slight improvement of the spacing between the ribs in the middle. But if we look at these ribs, right? So you see these ribs here. So you can see that the angle of these ribs became more vertical, right? So you see these ribs were flatter and now they are more tilted. So, but these ones were more tilted. Now this is a bit flatter, right? So, which tells us that fundamentally the total situation hasn't changed much. So you see what these people would be relying on. They would be relying on keeping it until the whole thing fuses. And that is really the main explanation. So the main explanation is that when it comes to the designs of the braces and so on, the braces are designed to create the loads there, and these loads are sort of forced into straightening. And in reality, as you look, for example, at this one, right? So you see, this is very scary. This is one of the, very old versions, which is called the Milwaukee brace, right? So you see, and this is what they're doing. So the logic of all the braces is try to force the situation into the middle. So push it into the middle. So from here, you're applying the force, and from here, you're applying the force, and then you're restricting the pelvis, and then you're keeping this whole thing together, right? And you see the old versions, they also had all this stuff like getting the person at the neck and so on. So, but as you understood, correction itself via these forceful measurements measures is very limited. So typically, what is the outcome of those approaches? The typical outcome of these approaches is the increased and speeding up the fusion. But you see, when it comes to the ordinary people, so who have this kind of milder versions of scoliosis, you can compress, fuse, and get something going there so that they can go through life. But when we look at the scoliosis in the children with the CP, it's critically different. They don't have those connections. You see, right away, the space between the vertebrae is so limited. If you look at this type of the improvement as a great success via the bracing, right? So what you are seeing here, you're seeing Look, it was 37, 32, now it's 19 and 14. So wow, the great improvement. But look, what's happening? First of all, in the beginning, this person had some spacing between the vertebrae, right? Now, this spacing has decreased. So what happened under the loads, the whole thing got fused together. So it wasn't just improved, it was put under the loads and fused together. So, but when you look at the one from the channel with CP or this one, for example, right? What you're seeing, the ribs collapse and you're seeing the fusion. See, if I zoom in, you don't see anything between the vertebrae. There is already no space. Everything is already fused and collapsed. Unlike this one, right? So you see, and that's really the key point. So for the milder versions, for the regular scoliosis, what you have, these are the people who have some spaces. So by forcing things together, you can get them closer, reduce the angles, and then kind of the whole thing under the load just get fused. So you see, that's why it gets white. So but when we look at the child with the CP, so what's happening there? There is no such room. The vertebrae are already very close to each other. So if you squeeze it, you don't produce any, you don't have the room for this. So that is really the main trouble to understand. And then as we go on, like we would see this all sorts of these situations and how the whole idea is working. And look, what I wanted to bring, right? So you see, I brought this X-rays here for you to get some additional understandings. So I hope that it's still visible, but you can see, look, these are regular people with strong pelvises and the strong connections here. Even this sort of older lady has it, right? So you see like but I also like this picture because it starts explaining us what we are looking at, right? So you see what we are looking at in ABR. So when we are looking at it through the ABR lens, we're saying, hey, this lady has this support suspension from the top. So these top levels of the ribs are well aligned, but well connected. So well connected, properly volumized and independent. But here, her abdominal support level is very, very poor. So then, boom, this is where she collapsed. So for us, what we would want actually to start building the supports and the distribution. So where we would be starting to strengthen the weak elements that she has abdominally, and on the other hand, get more out of her current strengths, which are at the top. So, and that's how we would work. We would start connecting the top to the bottom. So the area which she's stronger at, we can use that area to get more. So it would help the other areas more. And the area where she's super weak, we would be addressing that area to build their improved support within the abdominal cavity itself. So that would be the logic, right? So you see, if we follow this entire idea, so we would be looking at activating all of those connections and getting further and building all this, all this additional capacity. So, and that's where we would be looking at the individual ribs, how to link them together, and so on and so forth, right? So that's really how we would take the whole situation on board. So just wanted to mention maybe a couple of other things. So you see here, overall, right? So you see, for example, this is the person, this is a promotion of the new types of the brace. So that, let's say, before the braces were bad, the braces were cumbersome, and now the new one is much more convenient, and it's a 3D, calculation of forces and so on, which is true. So obviously, if you compare this Boston brace, which sort of stems from 1950s or 1960s, with this new ginseng brace, which is kind of maybe 15, 20 years old. So of course, this is much more convenient, much more wearable, and much more like much easier to deal with. But the big principles, Cobb angle, punishment for the space, for the additional spacing between the between the vertebrae, not being able to improve the connections between the ribs, and relying on the natural spinal fusion as the main source of correction still remains. So in that sense, if we look at this view and understand the the treatment approaches, we have to get this basic idea. You see here, I pulled the pull it from some of the cerebral palsy news today. Surgery cited as the best way for children with cerebral palsy to manage scoliosis, right? So effectively, that's the logic. The logic is force it, fuse it, and you know keep it together in a forceful way. The brace tries to do this via natural fusion. You see, this person started like this. That's the view on the left, right? So nobody tried to improve the situation for the ribs, but in fact, what was happening, the spine itself was getting whiter and whiter, right? So under the brace loads, trying to get more of this response, right? So of this kind of get the fusion into the spine naturally via the, like without the surgical means. And then you've got, okay, it doesn't work. And especially in the lumbar spine, it doesn't work. So let's put the fusion. So the logic there, connect it, and stabilize it via the fusion. Of course, what is ABR logic? Stabilize via maximum distribution, not via concentrated fusion, but via maximum distribution. So that's our big idea. And in that sense, you see, if we look at the ways how these people are treating the situation, right? So the typical situation is this. So you see here, spinal curvatures are usually determined using the standard measurement by Cobb angle. We already understood this, right? So what are the recommendations here? Mild, right? Mild. What is the treatment? Observation. Can you possibly imagine this? Think of it. If you really had the tools to improve the situation, what would you want to do? Would you want to do it when it's mild, or would you want to do it when it's advanced? Of course, mild should be easier to improve. But why do you say observation? Because at the end of the day, you realize that your methods, bracing and so on, they cause fusion, they cause so many of the side effect troubles, that you realize that for the mild, the thing maybe it will self-fuse itself without the need for this external punishing moves. So that's why this completely illogical idea of observation instead of early action, that's why this idea predominates. So what is this moderate? Watchful waiting. Can you imagine these terms? Watchful waiting. You see that the situation is getting worse, and what are you waiting for? Well, you're waiting for the surgery. You're waiting for the things to fuse and stabilize. You're hoping it will get white and fused, as we saw in this example, that it would whiten. It was 37 and then it whitens and kind of straightens. So that's what you're looking for. And bracing is just making it, like fusing it further. So, but my point, when you look at the channel with CP, these things, they don't work, because it's already very much fused. And there are so many collapses on the ribs and so on. So it's basically these standard moves are not helping. So we have to think about the whole situation in a completely different way, how we can rebuild the distributed support, how we can utilize the natural drivers of symmetry, such as the respiration, into the development of the back, how we can organize the maximum contribution of force transmissions via the fascia, how we can get the maximum support via the body cavities and so on. So these are the main points. So that's what I really wanted to say, right?